Welcome to the third part of my mini-series about the BBC sitcom pilot The Jewel in the Crown, Southall, Middlesex. In part one we looked at how the pilot introduced Spike and Eric and how the audience reacted to seeing a relic of an outdated comic style. In part two we looked at how the patchwork of plot elements simply didn't come together. Now let's see how this pilot could never have worked in 1985. Comedy is successful, ethical and enduring when it punches up, a principle in comedy which targets those with more power, influence or status than the comedian or the audience. It focuses on institutions, oppressive systems or wealthy and influential individuals. It highlights an absurdity in how power is exercised, making the audience feel a sense of shared justice through laughter. The Jewel in the Crown, Southall, Middlesex punches down. It targets immigrants, South Asian communities, a lonely cleaner, a naive young woman and the working class customers. By mocking the powerful, comedy acts as a tool for social critique. Here there's no satirical frame, no commentary on social injustice, no critique of an institution or powerful regime, just behaviour. When comedy punches down, targeting marginalised or vulnerable groups, it can feel like bullying. It becomes uncomfortable instead of funny, and surrealism cannot survive when the underlying worldview is mean-spirited. In the 1960s, Speight's bigots were meant to expose prejudice. In Till Death Us Do Part and its sequels, Till Death on ITV and In Sickness and in Health, Alf spouted contemporary pejorative terms for non-white immigrants. Speight claimed these were to highlight and satirise the ignorance of people like Alf in their blanket bigotry against foreign settlers. So it's understandable that the show came in for criticism for the racist views, but it also fuelled support for people who genuinely shared Alf's opinions. Speight's Curry and Chips, which also featured Milligan in brownface, illustrated the standard tone of racial humour that was common at the time. By the 1980s, the technique of a bigot espousing blatantly racist views to highlight and satirise the ignorance of people like Alf Garnett no longer worked. Audiences didn't need a bigot to tell them bigotry was bad. Vocal sections of the public made it clear that the racist rhetoric had become increasingly unacceptable. The satire had evaporated, leaving only the surface behaviour, the accents, the stereotypes, the discomfort. Without a clear satirical frame, the bigot becomes the mouthpiece. In The Jewel in the Crown, Southall, Middlesex, the satire has evaporated. What remains is lazy stereotypes, discomfort for the audience, jokes without targets and a worldview that feels fossilised, a relic that no longer represented a majority of the current audience. The script is the sound of a writer repeating a rhythm he can no longer justify. Milligan's Q sketch shows worked because they were allowed to be anarchic, borrowing tropes from his radio goon show days where anything was possible, a style later developed by the Monty Python team. But here, Spike is trapped inside a traditional sitcom. You can see him trying to break out. He corpses in moments where perhaps Eric has improvised to cover a forgotten line, or when Spike just found him funny. Spike suddenly adopts comedy versions of foreign accents. The script allows him to drift off in the Dolly Parton dream monologue, some of which seems to be extemporised. But the sitcom setup keeps snapping him back to the plot-based format, despite the plot being somewhat flexible and incomplete. Eric Sykes looks uncomfortable in his role. He is a master of gentle, structured comedy, like his traditional sitcoms, Sykes and A and Sykes. Eric thrives on warmth, rhythm and clear character dynamics. This pilot gives him chaos, mostly in the form of Spike's characteristic oddball behaviour, cruelty, with comedy that punches down and mocks other ethnic groups, broken plots, although a worthy attempt at a surreal defence against the VAT man starts to develop and then is abandoned before any conclusion. He has no emotional anchor. He will raise an eyebrow, sigh, oh dear, but you never get a sense of what he feels beyond the surface gesture. There's no psychological depth implied. He often looks bewildered because the material doesn't suit him. His presence pulls the show away from surrealism, not toward it. British television comedy series are noted for often employing a surreal yet grotesque way of using cultural references and daily life scenarios to create humour. The depiction of race relations and ethnic minorities within British film and television, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s, represents a notable and frequently debated subject within academic research. Works like Johnny Speight's Till Death Us Do Part, while intended by their creator to ridicule bigoted views, often face the unintended consequences of the audiences identifying with the bigoted character Alf Garnett. This highlights the inherent complications and the unpredictability of the viewer's reactions to television productions. To understand why a show like this struggled to work, it helps to look at how British media of the period handled race more broadly. Cultural theorist Stuart Hall argued that much of the racism in British broadcasting wasn't overt but inferential, built into the assumptions about what audiences would accept. Stuart Hall's influential essay, The Whites of Their Eyes, Racist Ideologies and the Media, argues that telling racist jokes reproduces the categories and relations of racism, even while normalising them through laughter. In this analysis, Stuart Hall is suggesting that racist jokes reinforce stereotypes and power dynamics each time they are told. The humour serves to normalise racist ideas, and by laughing, people implicitly accept the underlying prejudice. This repeated exposure and acceptance diminishes the perceived harm of racism, ultimately trivialising the serious negative effects it has on individuals and society. Hall stated that, in Britain, the societal context had certainly not yet arrived for genuinely non-racist humour between different racial groups. This concept is crucial for analysing the problematic nature of the Jewel in the Crown Southall Middlesex. Seen through that lens, the BBC's hesitation makes more sense. The pilot wasn't mocking Southall's Asian community, but it did centre them, and that alone placed it outside the safe, familiar templates of other 1970s and 1980s sitcoms. The mid-1980s marked a period of significant change, with British television moving with the times and beginning to respond, albeit awkwardly, to calls for greater sophistication in black representations. The launch of Channel 4 in 1982, with its unique public service remit to serve minority interests, diversified the comedic landscape by commissioning black and Asian-themed sitcoms such as No Problem, indicating a growing demand for more authentic and less stereotypical representations. There had been a TV sitcom that was surreal and anarchic that actually worked. The Young Ones ran on BBC from 1982 to 1984. The Young Ones was anarchic with intention. It looked chaotic, but it had a clear creative engine. It was anarchic and surreal. It punched up and had anti-establishment energy. It had punk sensibility and political bite. There was a deliberate rejection of sitcom roles and a cast who belonged to the moment. Its surrealism wasn't random, it was a weapon. Talking mice, the atomic bomb in the kitchen, and Alexei Sayle appearing as all of the Belowski family. All of it served the show's worldview. It was chaos with a point. The Jewel in the Crown Southall Middlesex tries to be anarchic, but it is without purpose, without anger, and without a worldview. It's a surrealist show from the early 1970s, accidentally filmed in 1985. The contrast exposes how out of time it is. The pilot tries to be anarchic, but only in flashes. Spike's ginger beard disguise, Eric's fly-breeding stud farm, the girl falling down the stairs who's never mentioned again, the Chinese takeaway finale. These are Milligan Q-style ruptures, but they're trapped inside a Sykes sitcom framework. It's like watching someone try to do the Young Ones using the grammar of Sykes and the worldview of Till Death Us Do Part. The result is just tonal confusion. The Young One surrealism was politically upward punching. Its targets were Thatcherism and the establishment, the police, the media and the middle class. The Jewel in the Crown Southall Middlesex punches downward with South Asian stereotypes, brownface and mocking impoverished communities. The pilot's content was viewed precisely as the sort of programming which alternative comedy was supposed to have killed off. This new wave of comedy frequently challenged explicit racism and established norms of earlier sitcoms, underscoring their anachronistic nature and misalignment with the evolving comedic landscape of the 1980s. However, the suggestion that alternative comedy was always some sort of positive cleansing force has to be taken with a pinch of salt, as not all traditional comedy was bad, not all alternative comedy was good. In another universe, a surreal Jewel in the Crown Southall Middlesex could exist. That show could have been bizarre, artistic and brilliant, but that universe isn't this one, and that's the tragedy of the pilot. It's the ghost of a surrealist show trapped inside the corpse of a 1970s sitcom. Comedy had become sharper, angrier, more political, more self-aware. This pilot offers none of that. It's cynical, chaotic and oddly joyless, a throwback to a style that had already expired. Milligan, Sykes and Speight were comedy giants, but their comedic instincts were forged in music hall, 1950s radio, 1960s satire and 1970s sketch comedy. The BBC was trying to modernise. This pilot was a reminder of everything they were trying to leave behind. The failure of the Jewel in the Crown Southall Middlesex stems from a collective professional misjudgment driven by complacency, a clash of comic eras and a fundamental misreading of the contemporary social climate. Spike Milligan and Eric Sykes were titans of post-war British comedy, famous for their anarchic, surreal style. Their thinking was likely rooted in a sense of unquestioned comedic authority and a lack of self-censorship. Milligan in particular operated with a kind of creative immunity derived from his genius legacy performances. Having been heavily criticised for similar material in The Melting Pot a decade earlier, he seemed to believe that the sheer absurdity of his performance, or his self-awareness as an absurdist, transcended accusations of racism. The pilot offered a chance for a classic double act, utilising the physical and verbal chemistry they shared. They likely viewed this dodgy restaurant premise as just a vehicle for their classic antics, the beard disguise, the loud arguments, the chaotic phone call. They underestimated how much the context, the Indian accents and the Southall setting would dominate the material. For the Goon Show generation, using broad national stereotypes including Irish, Scottish and other foreign accents was a core element of the anarchy. They failed to recognise that a modern sitcom required a fundamentally different, more sensitive approach than a 1950s radio show. Johnny Speight was a master of controversial, politically incorrect comedy. He always maintained that he was writing anti-racist comedy by putting offensive words into the mouths of bigots like Alf Garnett. He likely believed that by showing two white men, Eric and Spike, failing miserably while putting on crude accents, he was satirising racism and fraudulence, not the Indian community itself. By 1985, Speight's writing style was arguably becoming dated and heavily reliant on old tropes. Instead of finding a fresh satirical target for Milligan and Spikes, he fell back on the ethnic stereotype premise he had tried and failed with a decade earlier in Curry and Chips. It was the low-hanging fruit of comedy writing. He overlooked the fact that the Indian characters in the Jewel and the Crown, Southall Middlesex, were not Alf Garnett figures being ridiculed. They were the central figures of the fraud, making the audience laugh at the stereotype rather than the bigotry. The failure ultimately rests with the producer and the BBC department head who commissioned the project. Their thinking reveals a major institutional lapse. The combination of Sykes, Milligan and Speight, three giants, was seen as a commercially irresistible package. Producer and director Martin Shardlow, who commissioned the pilot and accepted the script, likely believed their star power alone would generate huge ratings, which can lead executives to overlook problematic content. Shardlow's job was to ensure the script was fit for broadcast, and the recording captured a tight, well-paced show. The fact that the pilot was so long, at over 35 minutes, while the contract specified 30 minutes, structurally flawed, the unresolved VAT man subplot, and racially unacceptable, indicates a failure to exercise effective directorial or editorial discipline. It's possible Shardlow felt the controversy was worth the risk, hoping to test the waters for a return to this style of humour, but the speed with which the pilot was shelved shows that the BBC management immediately judged the waters to be scalding hot and pulled the plug. Join me for the final part of this mini-series, where we will see how having 3 top names attached to it helped this pilot slip through the BBC's commissioning process, and why it was buried immediately after recording.